6. Creedy stood up, breaking the circle. "You're being ridiculous, Mr. Spark. You've just had sufficient proof that your daughter was not murdered."
"And now you're trying to stir things up again. I think you want her to be murdered."
"There is witchcraft in the village. You all know it. All of you. You know it's true." This was not a conversation for the sunlight. James, the labourer, hunched to his feet. His chair squeaked as he moved it back with his calf muscles. "Ain't you talking nonsense? You are. You know you are. Witchcraft? Who's the witch, then?" "Some of you in this room are involved," shouted Mrs. Spark. Everyone began to laugh, asking one another between chortles, "Whatever is she talking about? She's becoming unhinged. Too much astral wallowing." "They know who they are." Mrs. Spark stood up. The laughter stopped and hid itself in the ice shadows. They waited. The listeners waited. "Revelation is at hand, saith the Lord." "Who killed my daughter? Who killed my daughter?" Rowbottom sneered at her. "If there's a witch in this village, it's you, ain't it? You tried to talk to the dead. You wanted the dead alive. The living dead. You, not us. I'm no witch, and you know it. Do we? Do we?" inquired Creedy. The listeners thrust their questions at her. She knew she was triggering the fever in them. She knew what the fever would bring. "If I'm a witch, what are you? If I probe the other dimensions to ease my pain, what do you do? What have you dragged yourselves to? You do not have to tell me. It is smeared on your faces. Perhaps," interrupted Creedy, inserting a razor blade into his voice, "perhaps the butterfly was the reincarnation of your daughter. Yes, perhaps with your witchery, perhaps you have turned her—" He tried to stop, his eyes creasing with laughter. But he gave up and let the laughter come. "Perhaps you've turned her into that jolly butterfly. Perhaps..." Mrs. Spark clawed towards Creedy, her mouth widened to show pinned teeth. It was not a pleasant sight. Creedy was reminded fleetingly of a vampire, but he was sure it was purely an illusion. Wasn't it? "You like death, don't you, Mr. Creedy? You're interested in the potentials of decomposition." As she breathed in his face, he was certain she smelt of a summer graveyard. "Did you murder my daughter, Mr. Creedy? Did you use her first with your sticky loins? Did you?" Creedy smiled. The smile was definitely nasty. Then he pushed his hand firmly into her pink mouth. She bit him twice. He jerked his hand back, throwing her against the tea things on the sideboard. He went after her. Fortunately, the squire stepped in between the Alsatian and the she-wolf. Creedy controlled himself. He relaxed. The killing instinct hibernated again. He examined the grey fang marks on the heel of his hand. Luckily, her teeth had not encouraged the blood into the light. He felt she would have been happier tasting his blood. She stared at him, realizing that she had done. He needed her. She knew that. They all did, even the squire. They knew her power. She would have liked to have savoured his flesh against the roof of her mouth. At least it would have been a reality. It would feed her until the time came. The squire fully understood the situation. He stroked the left sleeve of her knitted jumper. But he enjoyed the quiet electricity of the wool under his fingertips.
He could feel the feminine muscles tighten on her forearm. It excited him. Then she relaxed. The muscles slapped again. She forced a smile in the direction of the squire. He stopped stroking her sleeve and manipulated his words with care.
If you believe that Creedy or I or anyone in this room or in this village was in any way willfully responsible for the death of your daughter, I honestly recommend you visit the police station and state your case to them. In my opinion, you are constructing nightmares for yourself. You know it was an accident. I've read little psychology, but I know you only want your daughter's death to be a murder so you can work yourself up to a fever. As the squire here, I feel it is my duty to warn you of the harm you are doing yourself and everyone else. Accusations such as yours are libelous.
Mrs. Spark tried to speak, but the squire went on.
Shall we fetch the police, then? Shall we?
Creedy joined in the hunt.
Well, shall we, Mrs. Spark?
Rowbottom giggled like a tickled lizard. He jabbed at the cornered she-wolf.
Yes, let's fetch the police. They're so helpful, especially festival time, especially tomorrow. Look, I'll save you the trouble, Mrs. Spark. I'll fetch them for you.
The lizard slid to his feet. The werewolf smelt the mouths of the dogs. She was surrounded. In the eyes of the hunters, she could see acres of policemen grinning at her helpfully. The dogs waited to see what the wolf would do next. She moved back to the table. She sat down and lugged the monster Bible towards her. Everyone resumed their places. And the waiting continued. With a sharp movement of her hand, she opened the Bible and began to read the opening lines of the Book of Revelations. Anna and the children had reached the wood almost at the same time as Jippo and David were leaving it. If it had not been such a topsy-turvy village, David would have sworn that this accident was really design on the part of a precocious deity. No sooner had Jippo seen Anna than his deference to the inspector bloated to mock heroics, the more distasteful variety. He went straight up to Anna and cupped his left hand on her breast, the left one, naturally. Then he pulled her dark hair back and practically ate her alive. The children and the inspector were impressed. Such sexual gallantry. The prologue to rape. It was certainly very good entertainment in the middle of the afternoon. Any time, really, thought David. In reply to the grope, hug and kiss, Anna brought her knee up smartly in the direction of his excited potential. She didn't fully achieve the centre of the groin, but it certainly rang the odd bell. Jippo staggered back, cradling his privates publicly. Then he lay down in the correct fetal position and hugged his agony to him, whimpering. The actual cry was the hopeless keening of a baby monkey, one long-held note of nothing but infinite pain. He rocked backwards and forwards. He was very impressed. Whilst this sideshow progressed, Anna moved towards the inspector. She found him attractive, sunglasses hinting mystery, his mouth unusually cruel, even when he was smiling. And he was smiling now. "And who are you, then?" "I'm out of a particularly painful whimper." Jippo screeched, "He's a buggering policeman! He's a copper! Don't trust him!" And the pain took over again. Jippo had to be satisfied with the long, tearing vowels that erupted from him. He rocked to and fro, praying the pain would subside. No such luck. When the children heard the police announcement, their laughing faces masked to gargoyles. They backed away from him. Policemen were wrong-uns. David shrugged. Well, The news is out quicker than I thought. Anna stared at him. So things are not as right as they seem. Here is my mother's chance for further probing, and maybe he's interested in probing. I should imagine he's very stimulating, and by God, I need some stimulation. A real nature ramble. "Are you interested in strawberries?" she said. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean that, but perhaps you could help me." David acknowledged to the itch in his body that she was very attractive. She continued, "Children, go home." The children stood arms akimbo. They were not going to be pushed around by the desire which rippled along her nipples. She realized she would have to make them a promise. She called Billy over and whispered in his ear, "Billy, bring the gang to the Giant Oak at about 6:30 tonight, and we will continue our nature ramble. Now don't argue. We have a lot to do before tomorrow night." She curled one of her fingers in his greasy hair until it hurt. He went on grinning. "Right, gang," he shouted. "We're off, and don't argue. There's a lot to be done." In 5 seconds, he and his companions had disappeared. David noticed that Jippo's keening had subsided. Jippo levered himself to his feet and grinned. The hate was working overtime. "Now, copper, don't you go crawling out of your depth. She's mine. I own her. It's the only thing I own. If I smell you on her, anywhere, breast, navel, anywhere, you'll find yourself with a broken neck. Broken." Shouldering his bow, he ran painfully into the trees, shouting, "Broken! Broken!" Chorus to a pop song. Anna laughed. "Let me introduce myself," she said as she took him by the hand. "I am Anna Spark, and you've come to investigate my sister's death, haven't you?" Unbelievable, thought David, but there must be a catch. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me what you intend to tell me." He gripped her index finger with his signet ring. "Oh, I shan't tell you anything. You're supposed to be the policeman." She slid her hand out of his hot grip. "Maybe Mum will put you up whilst you pursue your investigations. I'm studying mythology at Bristol University, I think. I always believe it is better to put the books on the table. Don't you?" She moved towards the village, allowing her hips to continue the conversation. Anna turned her head to see if her rhythmical magnet was functioning properly. It was. She stopped, pursuing her nipples towards him, and then swung on. He caught her up as they reached the village. The amusement on his part had worn threadbare. He began to ask her pertinent questions about her sister and parents. The only answer he received was the electricity of her sheer stocking thighs rustling together as she walked. He was conscious her flirting was a strange blend of desire and secrecy. Yes, she had secrets which she intended to remain secrets, even under his X-ray scrutiny. And the secrets were by no means all applicable to her personally. No, they were secrets whispered for centuries in this village. They were the magic secrets of ordinary routine. Instinctively he felt that the village was as ripe as a sweating pear. And when it fell and burst it would pollute the air. He continued to question. She continued to flirt. They reached Sparks' cottage. Progress nil. Anna was about to go in through the shop but read her father's poetic note. "I'm in pub, Spark." So she took him down the shadowed alley and paused, expectant. He brought his face close to hers. "Forgive me for saying this, Miss Spark, but your upper lip is sufficiently voluptuous that, in my opinion, your lipstick overemphasizes it. Plus the fact kissing could be messy." She produced a lace handkerchief out of her pocket and wiped the offending lipstick. Then she pouted. Hanlin lisped his tongue on the underside of his teeth. "Do you think your mother will mind?" Anna drew in her stomach, exposing the sweep of her impertinent navel. Her breasts, with which he was over-impressed, rose towards his lapel. "Perhaps she wants to be kissed." He amused himself with the understatement. "Do you think your mother will mind?" "Try it, Mr. Hanlin, and find out. At the worst, you could only have a red face where the smack has been." "I'd love to," David replied, walking past her. "It's a very attractive cottage. I'd love it if your mother could put me up here." "There's teasing and teasing," grinned David. Anna sulked, foiled. She brushed past him and opened the side door. For over 200 years the sun had tried to bounce its way into these shadows, but only on certain middays did it ever succeed. And now, this afternoon, the shadows were cold as a dead star. They entered the house and they climbed the stairs. Still wearing his sunglasses, David found it extremely dark, in spite of the white walls. He was unable to take in the contents of the rooms. Now they were halfway up the stairs. She signalled him to be quiet. He tried to be, but it was very difficult. His steel heel caps rasped the stair treads. It wasn't any easier with his toe caps. Just before he reached the landing, he heard a little boy shouting from the loft. The boy's voice was high and hysterical. This went on for approximately 30 seconds. Then silence took over for 3 seconds. Then a little girl began to cry. The cry built to a boiling kettle scream which refused to be switched off. Hanlin paused outside the loft door. He whispered, "The hell's going on?" "Take no notice. Come to my bedroom. I need to change." "What's happening to those children in there?" She ignored his question and took him by the hand, indicating her bedroom. With her free hand, she opened the door of the room next to hers. "You could sleep in here now that little Dion—" David was listening to the unbearable screaming of the little girl. He could hear grown-ups giggling, supplying a macabre background to the scream. Suddenly the scream stopped. There was a thud of bone against wood. Then the boy's voice shouted a cry of exultation. This was followed by another broken scream and flesh thud. Quickly David grasped the doorknob. Anna whispered in his ear, "Don't go in there. Look, it's only a game. Just don't go in there." There was another thud. Some game. The scream sliced through his brain. He opened the door and charged in. 16 eyes flared towards him. All David could see was 8 people quietly sitting round a dark, polished table. Slowly, the birth of a smile whispered from face to face.
"Where is she? Where's the little girl? Well?"
The crying began again. This time it was a giggle whimper. David searched his eyes from face to face. Finally he arrived on Creedy's open mouth. The girl's snivel was curling from Creedy's mouth. Creedy closed his lips with a satisfied smack, jerked his head back, and laughed.
"And who,"
roared Creedy,
"who has had the honour of listening to my imitations of children unannounced?"
Anna stepped past David. Everyone was laughing. Even Mrs. Spark allowed a large smile to ripple through her teeth. For the first time, for 4 days, her emeralds mellowed to a summer, and the laughing joked on and on. "Let me introduce Detective Inspector David Hanlin of Scotland Yard," said Anna. Like a Rolls-Royce windscreen wiper, her words removed the laughter from the room, removed the laughter from the windows of their faces. Fear was thrust into their skulls. The impulse to laugh died. Anna spoke again. "He's come to investigate the death of my sister." David raised one eyebrow. "Thank you, Anna. I don't think I've ever been introduced with such stunning effect." Chairs screeched as legs pushed them away from the table. Everyone stood up, except Mrs. Spark. Creedy was the first to actually move towards the door. He swiveled on Mrs. Spark. "So you did call the police, Mrs. Spark. You tricked us into coming here. Very neat, I'm sure. Such advanced psychology. But by hell, you will have to answer this. I'll have you charged with multiple libel." As she stood up, Mrs. Spark knocked the Bible off the table. She found her toes flexing on its spine. She did not remove her foot. "It's a lie, Mr. Creedy. I swear I informed no policeman. This young gentleman will bear me out, and then he'll leave the village. Won't you, Mr. Hanlin? There's nothing for you here." The mother was going to prove difficult, as difficult as the sexy daughter. David turned to Creedy. "She's telling the truth, sir," David said. "This investigation is my idea, backed, of course, by my super. No, don't attempt to leave. Well, not for a moment. I have words to say." Mrs. Spark pulsed her nostrils. "You cannot help us, Mr. Hanlin, or Inspector, or whatever you are. You see, my daughter's accidentally tripped out of a tree and died. Accidentally." Relief, like a landslide, swept over the listeners' faces. "No, I am afraid you're wrong, Mrs. Spark. I'm very sorry to say, but we think it might be murder. I will question everyone in due course. Presumably Mrs. Spark knows all your addresses, so you can go in peace. I look forward to greater intimacy." Creedy deliberately pushed past him. David's hand clamped on his shoulder. "Mr. Creedy," snapped at him. "Creedy, retired great minor actor at your doubtful service, Herr Oberlieutenant." Creedy snapped into a Hitler salute and screamed, "Sieg Heil!" Then, with a flick of his voice, he proceeded to dazzle his audience with a brief display of baby noises. "Well, Mr. Creedy, it strikes me that you must have studied young children, 8-year-olds in particular, a great deal. Maybe the odd experiment too. Vocal, naturally. To achieve such consistent mimicry, you really must have put in a lot of time with your subject." "You are very observant, Inspector. It's true the village children often come to play in my garden in the butterfly season. Should you care to join us in some of the more advanced games, you are welcome. We always appreciate innocence." After the invitation was completed, the inspector allowed him to leave. Squire Fenn was the next in line for the exit. The inspector edged in front of him. "I'm Francis Fenn, Squire here, and I'm not sure whether I'm at your service. There's reservations on my visiting list. I think you're one." "Nice to make your acquaintance, Squire Fenn. Have you any little party pieces that might interest us?" "Yes, I warble on a flute, Inspector. Recitals are free to any time. I'll play very badly, do you see?" David leaned back on the right foot to allow the squire to pass him. "Oh, by the by, Squire, I will be visiting you." The squire adjusted his cravat, making sure the imitation diamond pin was still in place. Then he walked down the stairs. Rowbottom moved his lizard feet towards the inspector.
As everyone is chucking in their oar, I thought it might be of interest to you to know that my daughter Gilly saw the accident. She saw Diane fall right out of that tree, and Gilly's not a lying child, so you can forget any other ideas you might have had.
The inspector held the door open as the competitors for strangeness left. He noticed Mrs. Spark's silence. She was rethinking Sunday morning over again. The inspector watched her. She was one of those women who have no delta of calm. She was all ice storms and thunder mountains. A rose, to her, was not a natural sculpture in silence, but a beautiful terror on fire. He turned sharply as Mr. Spark lumbered into the room. Anna spoke. "Dad, this gentleman is a policeman." Anna began a recital of the official potential of David. She said that he would clear up once and for all the insidious rumours that rocked the village. She went on to request that he might stay in the spare room, Diane's room, until the mystery ceased to be a mystery. As she finished her epistle, she dropped a wet smile from the shine on her bottom lip in David's direction. This was observed and picked up by Mrs. Spark. Mr. Spark noticed nothing. "Well, Dad, what'd you say?" Silence. Mrs. Spark flexed her eyebrows and said, "Definitely no. There is nothing to investigate. Nothing. I have just been suffering belated shock. That's all." Mr. Spark was fascinated by the reversal of his wife's opinions. He had not been, as he often put it, married to green eyes for 27 years without realizing there was nearly always a fiddle. But what was the fiddle this time? That was the problem. In an oblique way, he knew in the one-way streets of his mind, especially seconds before leaping into sleep, that his wife was dangerous. Profoundly so. But she was mainly dangerous to herself. There was a twisting pain inside her. Many evenings when the moon would not come and the stars were dead, he watched the terror brood in her. A force not of herself, thrust fever in her eyes and her tongue. He had often asked her about it and been greeted with a blank laugh. She was afraid of talking of her depths. She was frightened of the barracudas and worse that lived in her imagination. Not only was she frightened of bringing them to the surface, she was frightened even to think about them as they battened on her. She was a very frightened woman. He watched his wife now as she continued to reiterate, "No, no, no, I don't want a policeman in my house. Say this, all of you. No!" Mr. Spark was considering possibilities. Perhaps this policeman could do some deep-sea fishing in his wife's mind and lug those fear-fish into the light. Anna, David, and Mrs. Spark turned to him. "Yes," said Mr. Spark. "He can stay. I want my daughter's death settled beyond any possible doubt. Hate is growing. Now, don't you deny it, Helen. You know it is. And I want no hate in my house. Anna will show you your room, Inspector." During this conversation, the three labourers had reseated themselves. They watched with interest as the scalpels were applied within the family. They were very amused. As the inspector followed Anna out of the room, they caught his eye by winking in unison. James wanted to split very badly, but restrained himself. His trouble in life was that he never missed, and that could have serious repercussions. Mr. and Mrs. Sparks sat down at the table facing the labourers. They were unsure where their relationship was leading them. James produced a pack of cards from his back pocket and proceeded to deal from the bottom. He felt the coming tension zip between his shoulder blades. Very exciting.